March 7, 1944. The morning sun glinted off Tokyo Bay as engineers at Kawasaki's Kobe shipyard watched something historic slip into the water. Taiho, Japan's most advanced carrier, represented 3 years of desperate effort, 32 months of construction, and the Empire's last true hope for naval superiority. She was beautiful, armoured, modern, a steel promise that Japan could still compete. Her armoured flight deck was a first for Japanese carriers, 3 inches of steel plate laid over structural steel, designed to resist 500-kilogram bombs. Her hurricane bow, copied from British practice, gave her superior seaworthiness in Pacific storms. Her island, larger than any previous Japanese carrier, housed advanced Type 21 and Type 13 air search radar systems. The flight deck measured 843 feet long and 98 feet wide. She displaced 29,300 tons, fully loaded. Every rivet, every weld, every system represented Japanese engineering at its absolute peak. The crew who would man her were veterans from Zuikaku, experienced hands who understood carrier operations at the highest level. She was supposed to be the first of 6 improved Taiho-class carriers. She was supposed to change everything. Across the Pacific, at Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia, another carrier was preparing for commissioning. USS Shangri-La had taken just 20 months to build, 12 months less than Taiho. She displaced 27,100 tons standard, could carry over 90 aircraft, and was powered by 8 boilers producing 150,000 horsepower. She was the 8th Essex-class carrier to commission that year alone, and she wasn't the last, not even close. USS Bonhomme Richard was fitting out at New York Naval Shipyard, just months from completion. USS Lake Champlain was taking shape at Norfolk. Within 12 months, America would commission 3 more fleet carriers while Japan's shipyards fell silent, their dreams drowning in resource shortages and industrial collapse. This isn't a story about battles. It's about the moment Japan's admirals realized they weren't fighting a navy anymore. They were fighting a factory system that could birth carriers faster than Japan could even dream them into existence. Stay with us to see how America's assembly lines shattered an empire's faith in qualitative superiority. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Before the first rivet was driven, before the first carrier slid down American ways, Japan believed it had solved the equation. Quality would defeat quantity. Spirit would overcome steel. It was a doctrine born not from arrogance, but from cold mathematics and brutal necessity. In the years following the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japan had transformed itself from a feudal isolation into an industrial power that stunned the world. Its engineers studied Western methods at universities in Britain, Germany, and America. They absorbed Western techniques, then refined them with Japanese precision and discipline. The victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905 proved that an Asian power could defeat a European empire using modern naval warfare. By 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy represented decades of focused evolution. Every destroyer moved with predatory grace through night actions, guided by optical instruments so advanced American officers later described them as impossible. The Long Lance torpedo, with its oxygen-fueled engine and devastating warhead, travelled 24 miles at 49 knots, far outranging anything the Allies possessed. The 6 fleet carriers that struck Pearl Harbor, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku operated with mechanical perfection that few navies could match. Their pilots had trained for years. Some had combat experience from China. They practiced formations until every movement became instinct. They knew their aircraft like mechanics knew engines. When they launched from 6 carriers north of Oahu on the morning of December 7th, they executed the most complex carrier operation ever attempted, with almost flawless precision. 183 aircraft in the first wave, 170 in the second. Coordination that required perfect timing, perfect navigation, and perfect discipline. Japanese naval doctrine wasn't built on recklessness. It was built on realism. Admirals in Tokyo understood the disparity. They had studied the statistics obsessively. America produced 7 times more steel every year. 10 times more oil flowed from American wells than from Japan's entire empire. American factories churned out automobiles, radios, and refrigerators in quantities that defied Japanese comprehension. The American economy, even in peacetime, dwarfed Japan's total industrial capacity. But Japan's strategists believed they had identified America's weakness, its Achilles heel in the coming conflict. Democracies didn't fight long wars. Consumers who enjoyed jazz music and Hollywood films wouldn't endure prolonged bloodshed over distant islands they couldn't find on a map. American mothers wouldn't accept their sons dying in Philippine jungles or on coral atolls with unpronounceable names. Public opinion in a democracy was fickle, emotional, manipulable. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Strike decisively in the opening phase. Sink the American battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor, buying 6 months to a year of unopposed expansion. Secure the resource zones of Southeast Asia, the oil of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber of Malaya, the rice of Indochina. Establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific, stretching from the Aleutians to Rabaul. Fortify each position until it would cost rivers of American blood to dislodge. Force the United States to negotiate a settlement before its industrial advantage could materialize into overwhelming military power. Every war game, every strategic analysis conducted by the Naval General Staff suggested it could work. Not guaranteed, but possible. If Japan moved quickly enough in the first 6 months, struck hard enough to cripple American morale, and held its defensive perimeter long enough, American resolve would crack before American production could tip the balance. The plan required perfection in execution, but Japanese officers believed their navy had perfected the art of war at sea. At Midway in June 1942, that doctrine met reality in the most catastrophic way imaginable. In a single day of miscalculation, tactical errors, and impossible American luck, 4 Japanese fleet carriers vanished beneath the Pacific. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, each one irreplaceable, each one representing 3 to 4 years of construction and decades of tactical development gone in hours. Japan's carrier striking force, once the most powerful naval air arm on Earth, was cut in half in a battle that lasted minutes in its decisive phase. The disaster exposed a truth Japanese planners had known intellectually but never fully confronted emotionally. Carriers couldn't be replaced quickly. They weren't destroyers that could be built in 18 months. They weren't merchant ships that could be stamped out in weeks. Shokaku and Zuikaku had taken nearly 3 years each to build from keel laying to commissioning. The new Taiho, already under construction since July 1941 at Kawasaki's Kobe yard, wouldn't be ready until early 1944 at the earliest. That meant nearly 3 years to produce one carrier. And America? America was just beginning to reveal its hand. In the months following Midway, intelligence reports began arriving in Tokyo that seemed impossible, that violated every assumption about carrier construction, timelines. American shipyards weren't just repairing damaged carriers like Enterprise and Saratoga. They were building new ones, multiple new ones, simultaneously, at yards scattered across the country from Virginia to Washington state. The first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex herself, had been laid down in April 1941 at Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Virginia. By the end of 1942, just 20 months after her keel was laid, she was already commissioned and working up her air group. 20 months. Less than 2 years from start to finish. Japanese carriers of similar size took 3 years minimum. How was this possible? Japanese naval architects studied the limited intelligence with growing unease. One Essex-class carrier was concerning but explainable. Perhaps the Americans had gotten lucky, cut corners, sacrificed quality for speed. But intelligence suggested there were more under construction. Many more. At Newport News, where Essex was, 2 more carriers were taking shape. At Bethlehem Steel's Fall River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, 4 more carriers were under construction. At Brooklyn Navy Yard, 2 more. At Norfolk, Philadelphia, the list kept growing. What Japan didn't yet comprehend was that America had fundamentally reimagined naval construction itself. At shipyards from Virginia to Washington State, industrial engineers had applied assembly line principles, the same principles Henry Ford had used to revolutionize automobile manufacturing, to warship construction. It was a philosophical revolution as much as a technical one. Traditional carrier construction treated each ship as a unique masterpiece. Japanese yards built carriers the way medieval craftsmen built cathedrals, with attention to every detail, with pride in workmanship, with each ship reflecting the particular skills of its builders. Plates were cut to size and hand-fitted. Systems were installed with care to ensure perfect integration. Quality control meant inspecting every weld, every rivet, every joint. America threw that philosophy overboard entirely. Essex-class carriers were broken down into prefabricated sections built in climate-controlled workshops far from the actual dry dock. Hull sections, bulkheads, deck panels, all were constructed in modular units by teams who performed the same tasks day after day until precision became automatic, instinctive. Welding teams worked in shops where temperature and humidity were controlled for optimal working conditions. They weren't rushed, they were simply efficient. Each section was built to standardized specifications down to the millimeter. When these massive prefabricated units, some weighing hundreds of tons, were transported to the dry dock, they were lowered into place like pieces of an enormous three-dimensional puzzle. They fit together with mechanical exactitude because they'd been designed to fit together. Welding teams then joined the sections, working around the clock in shifts that never stopped. The Essex class wasn't designed as a masterpiece. It was designed as a system, a product. 27,000 tons of standardized components, every radar unit identical, every gun mount interchangeable, every section of armor plate cut to the same specifications. If Yard Number 3 produced gun directors, those gun directors would fit perfectly on carriers being built at Yard Number 1 or Yard Number 5 because they were all built to the same blueprints, using the same tools, following the same procedures. This meant something revolutionary. If one carrier was lost in battle, its replacement was already under construction using the exact same blueprints, the exact same techniques, the exact same suppliers. No redesign was necessary. No retraining of workers. No adaptation of machinery. The production line just kept rolling, churning out identical ships month after month with increasing speed as workers gained experience and techniques were refined. By late 1943, the impossible was happening in American shipyards at a pace that made Japanese observers question their own intelligence reports. USS Yorktown, named after the carrier lost at Midway, commissioned in April 1943. USS Intrepid followed in August. USS Hornet, named after the carrier lost at Santa Cruz, commissioned in November, 3 fleet carriers in a single year. 3 complete, combat-ready, fully equipped carriers, each one capable of carrying 90 aircraft, each one faster and more capable than most carriers Japan had ever built. And this was just the beginning. The production tempo was accelerating, not slowing. USS Lexington, commissioned in February 1943, USS Bunker Hill in May, USS Wasp in November. In a single year, 1943, America had commissioned 8 Essex-class fleet carriers. 8. In 12 months, Japan's entire carrier construction program since Midway had produced nothing. Taiho was still in the fitting-out stage, months from completion. In Tokyo, the Ministry of the Navy struggled to comprehend the numbers being reported by intelligence officers. The reports had to be verified, cross-checked, questioned. Surely American propaganda was inflating the figures. Surely some of these ships were conversions, not new construction. Surely the Americans were counting escort carriers, small carriers that didn't match the capability of fleet carriers. But the intelligence was solid. Every report confirmed it. America had commissioned 7 Essex-class fleet carriers by the end of 1943. 7 carriers displacing over 27,000 tons each. 7 carriers capable of projecting massive air power across the Pacific, and the construction hadn't stopped. The schedules indicated that more were coming, many more. In 1944 alone, American plans called for commissioning 8 additional Essex-class carriers. 8 more. In a single year. The math was becoming undeniable, and it told a story that shattered every assumption upon which Japan's war strategy had been built. For every carrier Japan could build, America was producing 10. For every month Japan spent refining designs, scrounging materials, and training workers, American yards were launching another steel giant into the water. The qualitative edge Japan had relied upon, superior training, better torpedoes, more experienced pilots, more advanced night-fighting capabilities, was being buried under an avalanche of American production. What terrified Japanese strategists wasn't just the quantity, it was the relentlessness of it. American carriers weren't appearing in response to losses. They were appearing on schedule, predetermined, planned years in advance. When USS Hornet was sunk at Santa Cruz, the new USS Hornet was already under construction. When USS Yorktown went down at Midway, the new USS Yorktown's keel had already been laid. When USS Wasp was torpedoed in September 1942, the new USS Wasp was already taking shape in a Massachusetts shipyard. This wasn't reactive construction. This was industrial inevitability. America had turned carrier production into a calendar, a timetable that existed independent of battle outcomes. The ships kept coming regardless of what happened in the Pacific, regardless of victories or defeats, regardless of whether America was winning or losing at any given moment. The production schedule existed in its own realm, governed by industrial logic rather than military necessity. Admiral Yamamoto had once warned that attacking America would awaken a sleeping giant, but even he, with his years studying in America and his understanding of American industrial capacity, hadn't fully grasped what that giant would become once awakened. Not an army of soldiers, though America would field that too. Not a fleet of warships, though those would come in quantities that defied imagination. But an army of shipwrights, welders, engineers, and factory workers, building faster than Japan could destroy, producing with a patience and scale that rendered courage and skill increasingly irrelevant in the final equation. By the time Taiho finally commissioned in March 1944, she was already obsolete. Not in design, she was magnificent, perhaps the finest carrier Japan had ever built. But in context, in the broader strategic picture, she was irrelevant. She represented Japan's peak industrial achievement, the absolute maximum of what Japanese shipyards could produce. She was also Japan's last fleet carrier. While she prepared for her maiden voyage, conducting sea trials in the inland sea, America was commissioning its 14th Essex-class carrier. And the production lines weren't slowing. They were accelerating. In Japan's shipyards, the contrast was stark and brutal. At Kawasaki's Kobe facility, Taiho had consumed 32 months of construction, nearly 3 years of concentrated effort by Japan's most skilled shipbuilders. Every plate of armor had been precisely measured and fitted. Every rivet had been driven with care. Every system, from the radar to the catapults to the fuel storage, had been crafted with meticulous attention to detail. She displaced 29,300 tons, carried an armored flight deck that could resist bomb hits, and represented the pinnacle of Japanese carrier design. But she was singular, alone. One ship after 3 years of exhausting effort. The Unryu-class carriers, designed as simpler, faster alternatives to Taiho, were supposed to be Japan's answer to American mass production. Strip away the armor. Eliminate unnecessary complexity. Base the design on the older but proven Hiryu hull. Build them fast, and build them in numbers. On paper, the plan looked achievable. The Imperial Navy laid out an ambitious program. 14 Unryu-class carriers to be built over 4 years, 2 to be completed in calendar year 1944, 5 more in 1945, 4 in 1946, 2 in 1947, one final ship in 1948. It was Japan's attempt to fight American industrial warfare with Japanese determination, build simpler ships faster, accept that they wouldn't be as capable as Taiho, but produce them in numbers that could challenge American numerical superiority. The plan required everything to go right. It required steady supplies of steel from occupied territories. It required fuel oil to keep factories running. It required skilled workers who weren't being drafted into the army. It required components from suppliers whose factories weren't being bombed. It required time. Reality crushed those plans before the first ships even reached the water. Unryu herself was laid down in August 1942 at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Japan's premier shipyard. Her construction was given top priority. Her workers were the most skilled available. Her materials were allocated first from dwindling supplies. She took 2 full years to complete, finally commissioning on August 6, 1944, 2 years for one carrier. In that same period, from August 1942 to August 1944, America had commissioned 11 Essex-class carriers. 11 functional, combat-ready, fully equipped carriers in the time it took Japan to build one simplified design. The problems weren't technical. Japanese engineers knew how to build carriers. They had designed them, tested them, refined them for decades. The problems were material, and material problems grew worse with every passing month. Steel shipments from occupied Korea and Manchuria grew sporadic as American submarines began to strangle the supply lines connecting Japan to its empire. Every month, more merchant ships failed to reach port. Every month, more raw materials that should have arrived sat at the bottom of the Pacific in sinking cargo vessels. Copper, 4, electrical systems became increasingly scarce. Factories that once produced miles of wiring now struggled to produce hundreds of feet. Electrical systems that required copper were redesigned to use aluminum, which conducted electricity poorly and overheated under load. The redesigns took time. The substitutions reduced performance. Rubber for gaskets and seals simply vanished from supply chains. Natural rubber came from Southeast Asia, and American submarines had turned those shipping lanes into graveyards. Synthetic rubber required chemical processes that consumed scarce petroleum products. Without proper gaskets, pipes leaked. Without proper seals, pumps failed. Even more crippling was the machinery shortage. The Unryu class was designed to use turbines from Mogami-class heavy cruisers, specifically engines developed for those powerful warships in the 1930s. But there weren't enough available. Cruiser production had priority for the actual cruisers the fleet desperately needed. The turbines that were supposed to power Unryu-class carriers simply didn't exist in sufficient numbers. The solution was desperate improvisation. The 3rd and 5th Unryu-class carriers, Katsuragi and Aso, received engines cannibalized from Kagero-class destroyers. Destroyer engines, in fleet carriers displacing over 17,000 tons. The result was predictable and humiliating. Both ships lost 1/3 of their planned horsepower. Their maximum speed dropped from 34 knots to 32 knots. They were compromised before they ever left port, crippled by shortages that no amount of engineering genius could overcome. Amagi and Katsuragi were eventually completed, finished to a point where they could theoretically operate, but they never operated with the fleet. There was no fuel oil to run their boilers. Even if fuel had been available, there were no trained pilots to fly from their decks. The veterans who understood carrier operations were dead, shot down, over the Marianas or the Philippines. Their replacements were boys with weeks of training, kids who could barely land on a carrier in calm seas, let alone execute combat operations. And even if pilots had been available, there were no aircraft to equip the hangars. Aircraft production was faltering under the same material shortages, strangling ship construction. Kasagi was launched in October 1944, but never finished. Work stopped when she was about 84% complete, nearly ready for trials. She sat at Sasebo Naval Arsenal, a hollow shell lacking the systems that would make her a warship. In early April 1945, with American forces closing on Okinawa, work was officially halted. The workers were transferred to repair damaged ships or to build suicide boats. After the surrender, she was scrapped where she sat. Aso and Ikoma were suspended mid-construction and eventually used as stationary targets for kamikaze pilots to practice their final dives. Young men learning to die practiced on the carriers that were supposed to help them win. The symbolism was lost on no one. Japan had reached a point where its half-finished carriers were more valuable as suicide training targets than as actual warships. By late 1944, the truth was inescapable for anyone willing to see it. Japan had managed to complete 3 Unryu-class carriers after 2 years of maximum effort. 3 incomplete, compromised, underpowered ships that would never see combat. Meanwhile, American shipyards had produced 17 Essex-class carriers in the same period. 17 functional, fully equipped, combat-ready fleet carriers, each one capable of projecting more air power than Japan's entire remaining carrier force combined. The disparity wasn't just numbers, it was philosophy, worldview, competing visions of how to wage industrial warfare. American carriers were designed around a principle Japanese engineers found almost insulting at first, the principle of being good enough. They weren't masterpieces, they were products, standardized, reproducible, and built with a ruthless focus on speed over perfection. Japanese carriers were crafted like katana swords, each one unique, each one reflecting the particular skill of its makers. American carriers were manufactured like rifles, identical and interchangeable. At Kure Naval Arsenal, workers watched as partially completed hulls rusted in place through the winter of 1944. There was no steel to finish them. The steel mills in Kyushu were running at half capacity because there was no coal to fire the furnaces. The coal mines in Korea weren't producing because the miners had been drafted. The supply ships that should have carried coal from Manchuria were at the bottom of the Pacific. There was no copper to wire the ships properly. The copper mines in occupied territories had been bombed or sabotaged. The merchant ships carrying copper ingots had been torpedoed. The electrical systems that did exist used inferior substitutes that failed under load. There was no machinery to power them. The turbine factories couldn't produce enough engines because they lacked the precision tools necessary to machine turbine blades to exacting specifications. The tools came from Europe, and Europe was cut off. The few components that did arrive were often substandard, diluted with inferior alloys, weakened by the same resource collapse, strangling every aspect of Japan's war effort. American bombers made everything worse. Starting in late 1944, B-29 Superfortress raids on Japanese cities weren't just destroying factories. They were killing the skilled workers who knew how to build complex warships. Experienced welders who had worked on carriers for 20 years, trained electricians who understood ship electrical systems, precision machinists whose skills had taken decades to develop, men whose expertise couldn't be replaced, were dying in fire raids. The survivors were being drafted into the army to defend Okinawa or Iwo Jima or some other island that would fall regardless of how many men died defending it. The few skilled workers who remained were exhausted, malnourished, working with inferior materials under impossible deadlines to repair battle-damaged ships that would sail out only to be damaged again or sunk entirely. The entire system was collapsing under its own weight. In January 1945, the Imperial Navy Ministry officially acknowledged what everyone already knew but had been afraid to say aloud. No more fleet carriers would be completed. The Unryu program was suspended indefinitely. The improved Taiho designs, 5 ships tentatively planned for 1947 and 1948 under the G-15 project, were cancelled before a single keel was laid. Japan's carrier construction program, once the pride of the empire and the terror of the Pacific, was finished, done, over. The war would be fought with what already existed, and what existed was nowhere near enough. Yet, in that same dark January of 1945, across the Pacific, something remarkable was happening at American shipyards. 3 more Essex-class carriers were nearing completion despite the winter weather. USS Shangri-La had commissioned back in September 1944 after just 20 months of construction. USS Bonhomme Richard would commission in November 1944, right on schedule. USS Lake Champlain would follow in June 1945, slightly delayed only because the Navy had decided it didn't need her immediately. 3 fleet carriers in less than a year, business as usual for American yards. The contrast was crushing, overwhelming, a mathematical proof of industrial dominance. While Japan's last operational carrier sat immobilized at Kure for lack of fuel oil, while Japanese admirals debated which damaged ships could be repaired with non-existent materials, America was launching replacement carriers faster than combat could theoretically consume them. The production tempo had reached a point where American shipyards were actually slowing down, not because they couldn't build more, not because they lacked materials or workers or machinery, but because they didn't need to build more. The war was already decided. The outcome was inevitable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese naval officers studying intelligence reports in early 1945 confronted numbers that defied comprehension, that seemed more like propaganda than fact. America had commissioned 24 Essex-class carriers by the end of the war. 24 identical fleet carriers, each displacing over 27,000 tons standard, each carrying more than 90 aircraft, each powered by engines producing 150,000 horsepower, each capable of 33 knots maximum speed. Japan's entire wartime carrier construction, including all conversions, all light carriers, all desperate improvisations, totaled 18 ships. And most of those 18 were already at the bottom of the Pacific, sunk in battles from Midway to the Philippine Sea to Leyte Gulf. What made it even more devastating was what Japan discovered about American production capacity in the war's final months. The Essex-class program wasn't running at maximum output. America hadn't even tried to build as many carriers as possible. Instead, American planners had deliberately slowed construction in late 1944 when it became clear that victory was assured. 6 planned Essex-class carriers, hull numbers CV-50 through CV-55, were cancelled before their keels were even laid. Not because America couldn't build them, not because materials were lacking, because America didn't need them. The nation that Japan had bet would lack the will to fight a long war had built so many carriers it could afford to cancel ships already on the construction schedule. For Japan's surviving admirals, this was the final, crushing revelation. They hadn't lost to American courage, though American sailors and aviators had proven plenty courageous. They hadn't lost to American tactics, though American doctrine had evolved and improved throughout the war. They'd lost to American accountants, production schedulers, and factory managers. Men in suits who treated warship construction like automobile production. Men who built carriers the same way Ford built trucks, with standardization, mass production techniques, and ruthless efficiency. Fast, identical, and functionally endless. The war Japan had planned to fight, a war of decisive naval battles and superior seamanship, a war where quality and spirit would overcome material disadvantages, had never materialized. Instead, they'd stumbled into an industrial meat grinder, where spirit meant nothing and production meant everything. In that contest, Japan had never stood a chance. The moment of reckoning came not in battle, but in silence. In shipyards across Japan, half-finished hulls sat abandoned. At Kawasaki, at Mitsubishi, at Kure Naval Arsenal, the sounds of construction that had once echoed day and night simply stopped. Not because the work was complete, because there was nothing left to complete it with. The steel was gone, the fuel was gone, the workers were gone, the hope was gone. Men who remained walked past skeletal frames of carriers that would never sail. Kasagi, 84% complete, sat motionless at Sasebo, rusting slowly in the salt air. Aso, launched but suspended, was moored near Kure, where young kamikaze pilots used her deck as a practice target, learning to aim their final dives at a ship that would never fight. Ikoma, launched in October 1944, received bomb damage while moored and was eventually scrapped, without ever installing engines or aircraft handling equipment. These weren't battle casualties. They were industrial corpses, killed by a resource crisis that no amount of courage or sacrifice could overcome. In Tokyo, naval planners stopped discussing new construction. There was nothing to discuss. The steel reserves that had seemed adequate in 1941 were exhausted. The oil wells of the Dutch East Indies might as well have been on the moon for all the good they did. Even if tankers had been able to reach those wells, which they couldn't because American submarines controlled the sea lanes, there were no tankers left to carry the oil. The skilled labor force that had built carriers in the 1930s was decimated. Some had died in air raids. Some had been drafted. Some had been transferred to repair facilities that struggled to keep damaged ships operational for one more mission. Even if Japan had possessed infinite resources dropped from the sky by magic, the mathematics were already written in steel. America's production lead was insurmountable. For every month Japan might hypothetically finish one carrier, America produced 3, 4, sometimes 5. But the true devastation wasn't just in the ships Japan couldn't build. It was in the ships America didn't need to. By early 1945, the U.S. Navy operated more than 70 carriers of all types. Fleet carriers like the Essex class, light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, escort carriers built on merchant ship designs. They blanketed the Pacific like a metal storm, like a swarm of steel locusts consuming everything in their path. Task forces numbering 15 or 20 carriers operated simultaneously in different parts of the Pacific. Task Force 38 struck targets in the Philippines, while Task Force 58 raided Japan itself. They launched 1,000 aircraft in coordinated strikes that Japan's remaining defenses couldn't even track accurately, let alone stop. The radar screens at Japanese airfields lit up with formations so large they looked like weather systems. When the first waves arrived, they overwhelmed defensive fighters through sheer numbers. When the bombs began falling, they fell for hours. The carriers Japan had managed to complete after Midway told their own tragic story, a story of effort and sacrifice rendered meaningless by mathematics. Taiho, Japan's most advanced carrier, commissioned in March 1944 with great ceremony and higher hopes. She was magnificent, her armoured flight deck, her modern radar, her veteran crew. She represented everything Japan could achieve when it pushed its industrial capacity to the absolute limit. 3 months later, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th, a single torpedo from the American submarine Albacore struck her hull on the starboard side just forward of the island. One torpedo, not a massive salvo, not a coordinated attack, one torpedo from one submarine that happened to be in the right place. Poor damage control, design flaws in her fuel storage system, and inadequate ventilation turned that single hit into a catastrophe. Aviation fuel vapors built up in her hangars. Damage control teams, many of them inexperienced because the veterans were dead, failed to ventilate properly. Hours after the torpedo hit, when Taiho seemed to have the damage under control, a single spark ignited the accumulated vapors. The explosion ripped through her hull like a bomb. By evening, Japan's most advanced carrier, the ship that was supposed to prove Japanese engineering could still compete, was gone. She took most of her crew with her. 1,200 men slipped beneath the Pacific, along with Japan's last hope for technological parity. Unryu commissioned in August 1944, just 2 months after Taiho sank. She represented Japan's attempt at mass production, simplified construction, faster building times. She never saw combat, never launched a strike, never recovered a single aircraft operationally. On December 19, 1944, while transporting aircraft from Cure to Manila, while trying to reinforce the desperate defense of the Philippines, the American submarine Redfish found her in the East China Sea. 4 torpedoes struck her hull. She sank in less than 8 hours. Of her crew of 1,200, only 145 survived the sinking and the cold December waters. Japan's answer to American mass production lasted 4 months, from commissioning to sinking. 4 months. Amagi and Katsuragi survived the war, but only because they never left port. With no fuel oil in their bunkers, with no aircraft on their decks, with no trained pilots to fly those non-existent aircraft, they sat at Kure Naval Base, useless steel monuments to plans that had collapsed under the weight of reality. When American carrier aircraft from Task Force 58 struck Kure in July 1945, when hundreds of Hellcats and Corsairs and Avengers swarmed over the base in the largest carrier raid of the war, Amagi was hit repeatedly. Bombs penetrated her flight deck, near misses opened her hull. She slowly listed to starboard, then capsized at her moorings. She rolled over and died without ever fighting. Katsuragi survived that raid only because good camouflage and a fortuitous position in the harbour hid her from the attacking planes. She was damaged but not sunk. After the surrender, she was used to repatriate Japanese soldiers from occupied territories, bringing boys home from China and Korea and the Pacific Islands. In 1947, she was towed to a shipbreaker and cut apart for scrap. Her steel, which had been intended to project Japanese power across the Pacific, was melted down and turned into construction materials for rebuilding cities that B-29 raids had burned. The comparison was brutal, mathematically brutal, a final accounting that allowed no argument. Japan completed 4 fleet carriers after Midway, 4 ships representing years of effort, impossible resource allocation, and desperate compromise. 3 were sunk in combat or accidents. 1 survived by never fighting. In that same period, from June 1942 to August 1945, America commissioned 21 Essex-class carriers. 21 identical ships. All reached combat zones. All projected American air power across the Pacific. All contributed to victory. And America's shipyards were slowing down not because they'd reached their limit, but because there was no enemy left worth building more ships to fight. For Japan's admirals who survived the war, the final months brought a series of realizations, each more devastating than the last. First came the acceptance that they couldn't win. That realization arrived for some at the Philippine Sea in June 1944, for others at Leyte Gulf in October, for a stubborn few not until the fires at Tokyo made denial impossible. Then came the understanding that they'd never had a chance, that even if Midway had gone differently, even if Nagumo had found and sunk the American carriers, it wouldn't have mattered. America would have built more. 6 months later, a year later, America would have had more carriers than Japan could sink. The production schedules proved it, the factories proved it, the mathematics proved it. Finally came the crushing knowledge that the entire strategic foundation of the war had been built on a miscalculation so fundamental it bordered on delusion. Japan had assumed America would fight like Japan expected, cautiously, conservatively, bound by traditional naval doctrine and limited industrial capacity, bound by public opinion and casualty aversion. Instead, America had invented a new kind of warfare entirely. Industrial warfare. A conflict decided not by the bravery of sailors or the skill of pilots, but by the output of shipyards, the efficiency of supply chains, and the relentless mathematics of mass production. By mid-1945, intelligence reports reaching Tokyo painted a picture beyond comprehension. America hadn't just replaced its carrier losses, it had built a fleet larger than the entire pre-war Japanese Navy, combined, and it had done so in less than 4 years. The carriers that now prowled the waters off Japan's coast, launching strikes against cities and factories with impunity, represented more combined tonnage than every Japanese carrier ever built across 50 years of naval aviation. And they were just a fraction of America's total naval strength. Just the fleet carriers. Not counting the escort carriers, the light carriers, the battleships, the cruisers, the destroyers, the submarines, the amphibious ships, the supply vessels, the entire vast armada that America's industrial base had vomited forth. The Essex-class ships that had shattered Japan's dreams kept their names alive through a haunting pattern. that Japanese officers found psychologically devastating. When USS Yorktown was sunk at Midway, America simply built another Yorktown. When Hornet went down at Santa Cruz, America built another Hornet. When Lexington was lost at Coral Sea, the name was reborn on a new hull. It wasn't sentiment alone, though American sailors certainly felt pride in carrying historic names. It was a message. For every ship Japan managed to sink, and sinking American carriers required tremendous effort and sacrifice, America would build 2 more. And those replacement ships would carry the same proud names, flying the same proud colors, crewed by men who understood they were part of an unstoppable tide. It was psychological warfare through industrial dominance. A reminder visible in every task force that American production was infinite and Japanese victory was impossible. Japan's final carrier, Shinano, represented both the empire's peak achievement and its ultimate futility. Converted from a Yamato-class super battleship hull, the largest battleship hull ever constructed, she was the biggest carrier ever built. 72,000 tons of displacement, 900 feet long, an armored flight deck that could theoretically resist even heavy bombs. Massive fuel and ammunition storage capacity designed to support other carriers, to act as a floating supply base for carrier task forces. She was designed to be unsinkable, protected by the same armor schemes that made Yamato and Musashi nearly invulnerable to conventional attack. On November 29, 1944, just 10 days after commissioning, while conducting sea trials from Yokosuka to Kure, while her systems were still being tested and her crew still learning her capabilities, the American submarine Archerfish found her. Commander Joseph Enright maneuvered his submarine into attack position. He fired 6 torpedoes. 4 hit Shinano's hull on the starboard side. The torpedoes weren't particularly large or advanced. They were standard Mark 14 torpedoes with standard warheads, but they struck below the waterline where Shinano's armor was thin. Poor damage control by inexperienced crew, design flaws that weren't yet understood, and overconfidence by the captain who didn't believe submarine torpedoes could sink his ship, combined to turn 4 torpedo hits into a death sentence. Shinano sank in less than 12 hours, just 10 days after commissioning. 3 years of construction at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. Irreplaceable resources. The finest Japanese engineering applied to the largest carrier hull ever built. Destroyed in a single encounter before she ever reached her home port, before she ever launched or recovered an aircraft, before she ever contributed anything to Japan's war effort, except as a lesson in hubris. Her loss symbolized everything. 3 years of construction, resources that could have built 3 or 4 Unryu-class carriers, and the finest Japanese engineering, destroyed in a single night by a single American submarine. Meanwhile, American Essex-class carriers absorbed kamikaze strikes that killed hundreds of sailors and burned holes in their flight decks. Yet they were back in action after repairs measured in weeks, not years. American carriers weren't invincible, but they were replaceable, and in the mathematics of total war, replaceable was the same thing as invincible. As the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, Japan's remaining naval officers confronted a final humiliation. When USS Lake Champlain commissioned on June 3, 1945, she was the latest in an unbroken production line stretching back to 1942. She was effectively surplus equipment. Japan had no carriers left to fight her, no aircraft to challenge her air wing, no navy remaining that could threaten her supremacy or force her to prove her worth in battle. America had built so many carriers that they were operating them in supporting roles, running logistics missions, transporting aircraft from rear areas to forward bases, evacuating wounded soldiers from island battlefields. The Essex-class ships that had been designed to win a carrier war against Japan were now being used for occupation duty and humanitarian missions because the enemy they'd been built to fight had ceased to exist as a meaningful military force. The final numbers told a story that no amount of courage, no amount of sacrifice, no amount of tactical brilliance could rewrite. In calendar year 1944, America commissioned 9 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 complete, functional, combat-ready carriers in 12 months. Japan completed one, Taiho, which lasted 3 months before being sunk. In calendar year 1945, America commissioned 6 more Essex-class carriers, though several were delayed simply because the Navy decided it didn't urgently need them. Japan completed zero fleet carriers. After August 6, 1944, after Unryu commissioned and immediately became a floating coffin waiting for a submarine to find her, Japan's fleet carrier construction simply stopped, ceased, ended. It wasn't a strategic decision made in a conference room. It was industrial collapse, a systems failure. The same collapse that had been inevitable from the moment Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor and awakened a sleeping industrial giant. The empire had gambled that a quick war would secure resources before American production awakened. Instead, they'd triggered exactly what they feared most. An American industrial mobilization so vast and so efficient, it turned warship construction into a calendar entry, a scheduled event as predictable as the changing seasons. When the final surrender documents were signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, American carriers filled the horizon in every direction. Essex-class ships by the dozens. Flight decks crowded with aircraft, their crews watching from railings as Japanese officials signed away their empire. And somewhere in that assembled fleet, perhaps USS Shangri-La, or USS Bonhomme Richard, or USS Lake Champlain, sailors who'd joined the Navy after Pearl Harbor stood on decks of ships that hadn't existed when the war began. Young men who'd been in high school when Japan attacked. Now they stood on brand new carriers, watching an empire surrender. For Japan's surviving admirals in their dress uniforms aboard Missouri, there was a final, bitter arithmetic to confront one last time. America had built 24 Essex-class carriers during the war. Japan, counting all fleet carriers built from 1937 through 1945, across 8 years spanning peacetime expansion and desperate wartime construction, had completed 10. America's production in a single carrier class exceeded Japan's entire carrier program across nearly a decade. And the Essex class was just the beginning. America had also built 9 Independence-class light carriers, 3 massive Midway-class supercarriers over 45,000 tons, and more than 100 escort carriers for convoy protection and amphibious support. The war Japan had planned, a war of decisive battles and superior training, a war where quality would triumph over quantity and spirit would overcome material deficiency, had been drowned in an ocean of American steel. The carriers that Japan had crafted like works of art, each one unique, each one representing years of focused effort, had been buried under an avalanche of mass-produced American efficiency. Quality had met quantity in the crucible of total war. Spirit had confronted manufacturing, and in the end, the assembly line had proven more powerful than any weapon Japan could forge. Years later, when historians studied the Pacific War and tried to identify its turning points, they would point to Midway as the decisive battle, the engagement that doomed Japan, that destroyed the carrier striking force, that shifted initiative to America. But the admirals who survived knew differently. Midway was important, but the war had been lost before Midway was even fought. The war had been lost the moment Japan attacked a nation that built automobiles by the millions, that welded ships like it, assembled radios, that turned industrial production into a national religion and mass manufacturing into an art form. America didn't defeat Japan with superior tactics, though American tactical innovation certainly helped. America didn't defeat Japan with better equipment, though American aircraft and ships had advantages. America defeated Japan with something far more devastating, far more unstoppable, far more psychologically crushing. A production system so vast, so efficient, so relentlessly mathematical, that courage became irrelevant and sacrifice became waste. A system where individual battles didn't matter because losses could be replaced faster than they occurred. The Essex-class carriers represented more than American naval power. They represented a new form of warfare entirely, industrial warfare, a form of conflict where victory didn't belong to the bravest or most skilled, but to the nation that could build faster, produce more, and replace losses with mechanical precision. Japan had entered World War II, believing that spirit could overcome material advantage, that courage and training could defeat numbers and production. The Essex-class carriers proved them catastrophically wrong. 24 identical steel monuments to industrial dominance. 24 proofs that in modern war, the factory floor mattered more than the flight deck. In the post-war years, surviving Japanese naval engineers studied American carrier construction with a mixture of admiration and despair. The techniques weren't revolutionary, they were obvious once explained. Standardization, prefabrication, assembly line logic applied to warship construction. Mass production principles borrowed from automobile factories and scaled up for ships displacing 27,000 tons. Japan had known these methods existed. Japanese engineers had visited Ford's River Rouge plant in the 1930s. They'd seen mass production. But Japan had never possessed the resources, the infrastructure, the raw materials, the industrial depth, or the continental scale economy necessary to implement those methods at American scale. The final crushing realization came in a simple comparison that required no complex analysis. Japan's most advanced carrier, Taiho, required 32 months to build. America's Essex, with similar displacement and capability, required just 20 months on average. Some Essex-class carriers were built even faster. USS Hancock took just 15 months from keel laying to commissioning. Japan built 1 Taiho, America built 24 Essex-class carriers. Not because American engineers were smarter or Japanese workers less skilled, but because America had built an industrial system designed to produce carriers the way factories produced automobiles, endlessly, efficiently, inevitably. When the last Essex-class carrier finally left service in the 1990s, when USS Lexington was decommissioned after decades as a training carrier, Japan had long since abandoned any thought of naval competition with America. A lesson that no military academy could teach and no amount of tactical training could overcome. That in modern warfare, factories matter more than fortresses. Production lines defeat battle lines. And the nation that can build 3 carriers while its enemy dreams of 1 will win every war it fights. Not through genius or courage or superior tactics, but through the simple, brutal arithmetic of industrial supremacy, through the unstoppable mathematics of mass production, through the devastating power of the assembly line. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.